So can you tell me your name and your profession?
Yes, Robert Foster Turner, Robert F. Turner. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia Law School.
Thank you. So this is the second interview with Professor Turner, and it's just a short one, but there's something we want to get his opinion. That's why we got this second interview. So can you make a comment or comparison of Ho Chi Minh and Gandhi, the hero of India, and his fight for India freedom?
Well, I think Ho Chi Minh started out as a patriot. As you know, for a while he used the name Win I Clock, or Win, who like Smith, who loves his country. And I think he started off as someone who did love his country. And then I think when he went to France and became a co-founder of the French Communist Party, and then went to Moscow, the French Communist Party was founded in December of 1920. And then he went shortly thereafter to Moscow around the world on a Soviet passport. I think by that time he had become an internationalist, not a nationalist. And in reality, there is a difference. He had what you might call a patriotic attachment to the cause of internationalism, but it was not the nationalist cause. It was not the cause of serving Vietnam or promoting Vietnam. Indeed, at one point he referred to my country, Indochina. Now, no Vietnamese patriot would call his country Indochina. Indochina was an artificial, zone of the territories the French had conquered. Tonkin, Annam, Cochin China, Cambodia, and Laos, and they had very little in common historically. But Ho. When every time he was forced to choose between Moscow's interest and the interest of the Vietnamese people, I believe he sided with Moscow. I believe his goal was promoting, Vietnam was one of the struggles that had to be won to promote world communism. But his goal was not to liberate Vietnam. His goal, he had gone beyond that, and his goal was to liberate Vietnam as one of the struggles that must be won for the glorious world revolution of international communism. So Gandhi was obviously a patriot, a man of remarkable courage. I don't question Ho Chi Minh's courage. I think he was a smart man. I think he was a brilliant man when it came to understanding Leninism and the idea of struggle, the idea of making temporary compromises with a political party or a labor union or some other group. So you wind up with enough people on your side to win every fight. And then once you win this fight, then you go on to another fight and you attack a group that has been supporting you because they thought you would support them if you won that attack. So he was I think he was a very intelligent political warrior, a psychological warrior. There are a lot of terms we use for it. But he was one of the best. I think he enjoyed being viewed by many people as a great patriot who fought for freedom from the French. I don't think he liked the French very much, but I think he was willing to. In fact, the March 6, 1946 modus vivendi that he signed with the French in Paris, where he welcomed the French back to Indochina to take back their old colonial territory, so that he could make sure that the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists headed by Chiang Kai-shek, would be ejected. Because at Yalta, during World War II, the Allies agreed that after the war, China would occupy Vietnam north of the 16th parallel, and this was not Mao's China, but the nationalist Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek, and Great Britain would occupy Vietnam south of the 16th parallel. And Ho could easily have said, I just want freedom and peace for the people of Vietnam, and could have set up a government that would have involved nationalist groups and others, but he didn't want that. He wanted a communist government, and thus he had to. The biggest problem with the Chinese nationalists was that there were nationalist groups in Vietnam, the VNQDD, for example, that were built following the pattern of the Kuomintang, and thus they would have supported the nationalist anti-French forces instead of the communist anti-French forces. And so Ho invited the French back and prolonged the war for years in order to avoid the risk that Vietnam would become free, but led by non-communist leaders, led by Phan Vai Chau and Ngo Dinh Diem and many others. Although as each year passed, there were fewer others because the communists were killing off the Vietnamese nationalists who refused to accept their direction, their leadership. And most Vietnamese who supported the Viet Minh did so because they wanted free Vietnam. They wanted freedom of religion, they wanted freedom of speech, they wanted the kinds of human freedoms that people all over the world want. And that was not what Ho was offering. Ho was offering a very authoritarian dictatorship, that would be subservient to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and also, as China became more important, to the Communist Party of China, the CPSU. And so, to me, I hear a lot of people say Ho Chi Minh was Vietnam's George Washington, and I just don't see that. And I'll give you a good example. Tito was the president of Yugoslavia after World War II and during World War II. After World War II, Stalin told Tito that Yugoslavia must sacrifice its interest for the greater good of international communism. Read that, Mother Russia. In other words, your people need to work harder and get less so that our people can do a little bit better. And Tito basically said, no, I don't care, I have no quarrel with the United States. What I want is, to run my own country for its own interest. And Stalin was outraged at that, and the Viet Minh radio denounced Tito as a tool of the American imperialist because of his fight with Stalin. Now, back in the 1960s, I used to debate professors on American college campuses, and I would point out that even in January of 1950, when Ho Chi Minh invited countries all around the world to recognize the new Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and Tito's regime was one of the very first to offer recognition. And originally, the New York Times said this was a great victory over Stalin because this showed that Ho Chi Minh was making a rude gesture, if you will, to Stalin to get Yugoslavia's support. But in fact, Ho Chi Minh refused to support Tito, denounced Tito. The Vietnamese communists never referred to the Yugoslavs as being communist. They said they were a neutral country, a third world country, not a part of the the socialist family of nations. And but the scholars on the other side would say, well, wait a minute, he needed Stalin's guns, he needed Stalin's money and assistance, so he had to support Stalin and to embarrass Tito. And well, okay, but what happened when Stalin died and when Nikita Khrushchev went to Belgrade and hugged Tito and said, we have no differences? And the answer is, North Vietnam continued to denounce Tito in Yugoslavia as the leader of the revisionist clique that was the greatest threat to international communist solidarity. So, there was no excuse that, he couldn't afford to offend the Soviet leadership because Khrushchev had just gone to Belgrade and hugged Tito. So that fight no longer existed. And if you read their newspaper stories and their radio broadcasts and their speeches, the Vietnamese communists viewed Tito as a great threat because they wanted a monolithic international communist movement where the Soviet Union was the leader and the other countries, basically carried out orders. Now, it's interesting because in the Sino-Soviet dispute between China, between Mao Zedong and Stalin or Khrushchev or Brezhnev or there were Andropov and a number of different leaders, Ho Chi Minh and his associates sided with the more militant wing headed by China and Cuba. And they said it was Chairman Mao who would best carry into effect the teachings of the great Lenin. Eisenhower had done a brilliant job of deterring Khrushchev. He basically told Khrushchev, if there are any more Korean invasions, we're not going to send American boys to fight Chinese young men. A place and time of our choosing massively. In other words, before you invade South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, you better think about what Moscow is going to be like after we've covered it in nuclear weapons. And Khrushchev was very worried by that. He said, he said the Americans are not going to respond to guerrilla warfare with sending in counter-guerrillas. And of course, as soon as Moscow had a deliverable nuclear deterrent, their own nuclear missiles and bombers, the threat that if you invade South Vietnam, we're going to respond by bombing Moscow, then raises the issue of will the Americans accept the bombing of New York, Washington, Los Angeles, Chicago to save Saigon? And nobody would believe that. And so Vietnam became the test case in the eyes of the Third World, and also the Communist bloc and the United States. Lin Pao, the vice chairman of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China, said that what is going on in Vietnam now is a test case. And once people in the rest of the world see that the Vietnamese have succeeded in defeating the imperialist Americans, they will see that what Vietnam can do, they can do. And thus there will be 1, 2, 3 mini Vietnams. And had that happened, we couldn't defeat many Vietnams. Fighting a guerrilla war is very expensive. It takes as much as 10 times more troops and money to defend than it does to attack. And the reason for that is, let's pretend you're not a government, but you're a bank security company, and you have 20 banks in your city, and you have to protect them. And there are 10 bad guys. But those 10 bad guys can attack one bank at any time they want to. And so you have to have enough forces to resist an attack by 10 bad guys at any one of your banks at any time, day or night. And so it's much more expensive to defend than it is to attack. And in that sort of strategic viewpoint, so Vietnam became a testing case. Had America walked away from Vietnam in 1964, 65, 66, my guess is we would have soon found ourselves facing many Vietnams, and then found ourselves facing, do we use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union and China? Or do we just sit back and watch as the communists take one country after another, as the leaders of these third world countries who don't want communism, they want control of their own country, but they don't want to be killed, and they don't want to risk communist aggression, and they can't rely on the United States. America cannot be trusted because America has just betrayed one friend it promised to support, to pay any price, support any friend, oppose any foe for the cause of freedom, as John Kennedy said in his famous January 1961 inaugural address. So Vietnam was a very important test case. I think we were right in standing up to the communists. I cannot find anyone on the other side to debate on whether Vietnam was a good idea or not, because Hanoi has given away all of their arguments. They used to tell me, oh, well, it's really just a civil war in South Vietnam. You know, the National Liberation Front / Viet Cong and the Communist Party in Hanoi, the Dang Dong Vietnam, they're not related. You know, this is independent. And another one said, no, it's really only one country temporarily divided. And when I say, oh, you mean like Korea? When North Korea invaded South Korea, the UN Security Council authorized the use of force. Yeah, both are similar. They were divided as a result of international conferences following World War, or in connection with the end of World War II, and in Vietnam's case, divided in July of 1954 at the Geneva conferences. But now Hanoi comes out and brags about the fact that on May 19th, 1959, the Politburo made a decision to open the Ho Chi Minh Trail and start pouring money, troops, weapons, ammunition into South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia for the purpose of overthrowing those governments by force. And when I used to say that's what's going on, he would say, no, Turner's lying. You know, this isn't true. This is just an indigenous revolution. The people of Vietnam have risen up against this corrupt puppet. And it was a brilliant political warfare campaign. And we did not understand that. We sat over here and said, hey, these hippies, these, bearded, protesters, nobody cares about them. Nobody's listening. The war is going to be determined by who has the most tanks and the most soldiers and the biggest guns. And Hanoi never believed they could defeat the American army on the battlefield. They were not fools. They were smart. They believed they could tie us down in the battlefield and allow their propaganda efforts to work in America, where they would go to speak to American students and anti-war groups in churches and tell them, did you know your tax money is going to support the rape and killing of Vietnamese women and the imprisonment of anyone who speaks out in favor of peace? I didn't know that. Well, that's horrible. And so people went out and protested. And the communists in Hanoi, but also with tremendous support from Moscow, from Beijing, from Hanoi, from Havana. It was a big campaign. All over the world told the people of the world the Americans are in Vietnam to steal Michelin tires from the Michelin tire plant, or oil, or some. They want the resources of Vietnam. They don't care about the people and about human freedom. Well, that was not the case. There were no resources in Vietnam that were worth a thousandth of what we spent on the war. In terms of rice or other things. I mean, Vietnam was a wonderful country with wonderful people who were very productive. They did wonderful things, but that's not why we went to war. We went to war because in 1945, we ratified the UN Charter, which said we would, as a world community, act collectively against threats to the peace to keep the peace. And that's because if you don't keep the peace, people commit aggression and people die, and the aggressors win, and then other aggressors say, hey, I'd like to have more oil, and they commit aggression, and we have to send our sons and daughters out to fight for their freedom. And so to a lot of us, the Vietnam War was every bit as much a struggle for human freedom as was World War I, World War II, the American Revolution, the Korean War, Operation Desert Storm, when we went to eject the Kuwaiti or the Iraqi army from Kuwait, and I took great pride in the fact that the American people had sent their children to war to protect the rights of Muslims. I'm not a Muslim. I know some Muslims. I have some good friends who are Muslims. But America believes in freedom. And we don't believe in just supporting people that come to our church, or just people vote for our political party, we have been willing over the decades to take on a wide range of bad actors for the purpose of promoting freedom of choice, the freedom of human beings to make decisions about their own future, to decide what kind of government they will have, how their resources will be used, and so forth. And it makes me tremendously proud. We went to Vietnam not because Vietnam had anything we wanted, but because we did not think that, I'm going to wait for her to finish her broadcast and I'll say.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, of course you can. No.
Okay. So what about when they compare communism and Confucianism?
Well, I'm not an expert on Confucianism, but the most important single element, maybe there's more than one, of communism, of international communism, Marxism, Leninism, also known as Leninism and by shorthand, two things. One, international in scope. It's not about deciding who shall run the government of South Vietnam or Cambodia or Indonesia. It's about controlling the entire world. And second, it's about doing so by force. Confucianism is not a philosophy, religion, whatever term you wish to describe it. I think both of those apply to it. It is not an idea about let us use force to compel other people to agree with us. It is a force that talks about certain important values, the rights of people, the rights of animals to be not mistreated, most other political organizations and religious organizations begin with a moral code. Do unto others as they would do unto you. It is wrong to murder, to kill. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Each religion has its own version, but most of the codes overlap. The Muslims and the Catholics and the Hindus, many of the principles are quite the same. No man should be a judge in his own case. This is the principle of justice, fairness. When you talk about international communism, it's a term that can be used to mean more than one thing. Now, obviously, communism can mean just living in a communal setting where everyone, does their own thing. Somebody over here raises pigs and somebody over here, grows corn, and then they share everything they've got. But when we're talking about Marxism-Leninism, we're talking about a philosophy and a process. And the process is one of strict obedience to leadership guidelines. There may be some religious parallels. The Catholic Church has historically said, the words of the Pope are infallible. If the Pope says something, it is the Pope expresses the will of God. But generally, that's not what you get when you get Marxism-Leninism. Generally, what you get is the party deciding what's in everybody's interest, and the first principle is whatever serves the party's interest is the thing that serves everybody's interest, and then sub-rule number one, whatever serves my interest as the leader of the party, that's really what everybody should be working to achieve. And it produces incredible corruption. There are many cases in the world where very corrupt governments have come to exist. And the people have grievances and they want to see an end to foreign colonial exploitation and so forth. And then the communists or the Marxist-Leninists come along and say, follow our leadership and we will bring you to power and train you on how to use guns. But by the time it's all over, you're not in control. The communists and their key people are in control and they're running things and they become essentially dictators oppressing the people. And so anyone who opposes the oppression of human beings, basically, ought to oppose Marxism-Leninism in all of its manifestations. There have been countries that have called themselves communist that have been less harmful than some of the worst. Yugoslavia, till well after the end of World War II, was incredibly oppressive. It killed millions of people, innocent people. And then when Stalin and Tito disagreed, a different correlation of forces, grew up, and it became less oppressive of its own people in order to get the support it needed to resist the external oppression from Moscow. But the idea that communism is just a political system, or it's just like Confucianism or Taoism or whatever. It's not a reasonable comparison. It's just not true. These other, whatever you think of them, and as I look at some of these other movements, most of them I find things to respect about. Most of them I find things I don't agree with. But I also look at them and say, it's not my job, living over here in the United States, to tell the people of Vietnam, what path they want to take to the market.
So throughout the war, you see many Vietnamese communists defected to South Vietnam or Free War. There's a program called what is it?
Open Arms, Choi Hoi.
Yeah, Open Arms. Yes. Over 200,000 of communist troops, defeated to South Vietnam, and then also after the war, we see many, high-ranking like Colonel Bùi Tín, even General Trần Văn Trà. He, the one that who, direct the Tet Offensive, and also General Trần Đô. They all voices, against or bitter about what happening to the country after the war. And even the pen now Western press call the spy who loved us, that Pham Xuân Ấn, he was, 2-star general, cover up like a journalist, freelance journalist for Time magazine. He also, in his late day, he wrote like this in Vietnam magazine. He said, all that talk about liberation 20, 30, 40 years ago produced this impoverished, broken down country led by a gang of cruel and paternalistic, half-educated terrorists. Why all those obvious signs of people rejecting communism, Vietnam communism, and Vietnam communists? How in the world that we still here in United States, people continue to support and the brutal communist regime in Vietnam? Why are many of them condemn Stalin and also Mao Zedong in China was dictator? Why is it they love Ho Chi Minh so much?
Well, it's interesting, and it's when you're struggling for your goal, sometimes it's easy to say, well, things are horrible now, but they'll be better once we achieve victory and once we have, utopia, once we have freedom for everyone and so forth. And as I said earlier, most Vietnamese who supported the Viet Minh did so because of what the Viet Minh, offered them. Now, it used to be, if you were an anarchist or a socialist, you would tell people, I'm an anarchist or a socialist and this is what I believe in. But one of Lenin's contributions was, no, your program, you do not advertise what we want to do, you advertise what we think the people would like us to do. You determine the aspirations of all the different organizations and interest groups, and you write a program that will appeal to them. I sometimes laugh and tell my students it's kind of like the Republican and Democratic conventions in America, where they write platforms and they try to appeal to every possible special interest group. But I think a lot of these people were not bad people at all. They joined the party because they thought that, first of all, French colonial rule was bad, was not good for the people of Vietnam. The people of Vietnam ought to be able to have self-determination and their own, the government of their choice. And because they were told, hey, these are really good people, we've just had some problems. Yes, there's been some corruption, but that's not the fault of our leaders here. And you get, we had Pham Son Sui, the journalist from
Xuân An.
Pham Xuân An, yes. He was very famous, but he was not alone. He was one of a number of very popular Vietnamese who hung around the hotels where the American journalists often stayed, the Caravelle Hotel, the Continental Palace Hotel, the Continental Hotel in Saigon, and the Americans most American journalists who went to Vietnam knew very little about Vietnam. And they would go into the bars and they would meet these articulate, fluent English language, obviously educated young men. And they would immediately say, oh, communism is horrible, but gee, I'm so ashamed, my own government is so corrupt. And they would be suckered in by this party line, if you will, and given facts that simply weren't true. The friend they made in the bar would take them down to the docks and say, you see these crates tonight? Well, tonight at midnight, they're going to be taken down to the black market and sold instead of, taken to the orphanage where they're and the American knew so little about what was going on, he could basically go, oh, that's interesting, and made a note about it. And so, the short answer is that Hanoi, basically, it was more than Hanoi. It was Hanoi with the backing of the very best that Moscow and Beijing and Havana had to offer. They were focused upon the political struggle, and they understood that they were never going to defeat the American army in the battlefield. What they could do is tie down the American army, inflict casualties on American soldiers, and while so doing, spread the word in America and in Paris and in London and around the world that the Americans are on the wrong side, that in fact the Americans are backing corrupt dictators who don't represent the will of the people and don't care about the rights of Vietnamese. And they bought this, and Pham Xuân An was a wonderful example. He was by far the most respected Vietnamese journalist in Vietnam throughout most of the war. And he was respected by William Colby, the head of the CIA, and later the head of the CIA at the time, or originally the CIA station chief in 1959, and later the head of the CORDS program in the Revolutionary Development. And they all thought, hey, this guy's really smart. He speaks great English. He's principled. And they were conned. And these men you've talked about, Bui Tin, he was the vice editor of Nhân dân, the People in Hanoi, and he was obviously told that once liberation happens, we'll have more freedom and better things for the people. And then when liberation happened, they saw the communists looked out for themselves, and the Viet Cong were pushed aside, ignored. You were nobody important. We just used you for our own goals. As somebody once put it, Hanoi was willing to die to the death of the last Viet Cong soldier. Well, they sacrificed a good number of North Vietnamese PAVN, or People's Army of Vietnam soldiers as well. But so some of these people were really honorable people, and they saw what was happening. They saw that corrupt goons had taken over, and they they could not stomach it. It offended their sense of right and wrong. And I'm not surprised by it. I'm saddened that they didn't see through it. There was a great deal of evidence of what was going on for anyone who bothered to read what I know he was, what they were publishing even in English. And most of my stuff, when I started studying Vietnam in about 1964, 65, I was getting booklets published by the Foreign Languages Publishing House in Hanoi in English, and I would read their version, their official history of Ho Chi Minh's biography. And they talked about Ho having been present in Macau on February 3rd, 1930, when the Indochinese Communist Party was founded. And Ho's role there was not as a Vietnamese nationalist. He was the official representative of the Comintern, the Communist International. He was Moscow's guy there. And the Vietnamese communists on their own had already announced the creation of a Vietnam Communist Party. And Ho said, that will not do. Moscow has set these instructions, and we must call it the Indochinese Communist Party and bring in Laos and Cambodia into the program. Because it's easier for Moscow to administer it, apparently, if they group them all together. And this was not a Vietnamese nationalist movement, but I don't have any doubt that many of the people who supported the party did so in the belief that they thought it would promote Vietnamese nationalism. It would get rid of French imperialism, it would get rid of the Americans and their puppets, Ngo Dinh Diem and others, although most of the senior defectors that I talked to understood that Diem was a great man, and they said that we viewed him as a great Vietnamese patriot, but we had to denounce him and turn the people against him because he refused to accept the leadership of the party, and that was essential. I remember driving back to Saigon one evening from Binh Tre, and it was probably 1970 or 71, maybe March or April, but I'm not sure. But we were chatting, and Mr. Quy, Nguyen Van Quy, my interpreter, was sitting in the back seat behind me, and Wu Trong Tong is up in the front seat. Now, Tong was the chief of culture, education, propaganda, and training for what they called Binh Tre province, what we call Kien Hoa province. So we were talking about a lot of things, and I said, what did you think of Ngo Dinh Diem? And party leaders put him in the same category as Ho Chi Minh, as a great, Vietnamese patriot, a great leader. But he was unwilling to accept the party's leadership. And so we had to discredit him with the people and to turn them against him. And so we called him a puppet and a tyrant and, dictator and what have you. But he said he was none of these things. He was a very principled, honorable man who loved his country and was trying to do what he thought was right for it. And that was the same message I got from a number of non-communist leaders in South Vietnam. Dr. Chan Van Do, Dr. Chan Van Do. I had dinner with him in I want to say maybe December 1968 in Saigon, and he had fallen out with Diem. He had been the head of the State of Vietnam delegation to the 1954 Geneva Conference, and but he still, said that President Diem was a man of the highest moral character and principle, and wanted to do the right thing. He loved his country. And he made mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, but he was a great leader. And it's but my guess is most NLF and North Vietnamese officials believed that Diem was a bad guy. Diem had been offered the leadership of Vietnam under the French repeatedly, under the Japanese, and even under Ho Chi Minh's own government. He was offered what was essentially the number 3 position, but it was not real power. It was a figurehead position because the communists knew that Diem was very respected by the people, and they wanted him on their team, if you will, and they also did not want him on the opposition team. And they thought that if they could offer him some title, maybe he would be a sort of a figurehead for them, and he wouldn't do it. He would not be a figurehead for the French or the Japanese or the Marxist-Leninists. And I never knew him. He died before I even really knew where Vietnam was. I learned, I was a student living in Paris in August of 1964, when all of a sudden the banner headlines in the Paris press, the Americans bombed the bases of North Vietnam. And I'm thinking to myself, what is North Vietnam? And I even got my atlas out, an old Rand McNally atlas my father had given me for Christmas in 1964. And I looked up Vietnam. It had Annam and Cochin China and Tonkin and Cambodia and Laos and Indochina. But it did not, it just created, it kept the old French divisions, which had ended, I guess, technically in earlier in 1954. I had to learn a lot about Vietnam in a short period of time, but I kept getting in debates with anti-war professors and students, and they just didn't make any sense to me. They were making accusations that they seemed to have had all these charges, that they were true. And I came away from it with a belief that what we had tried to do at the at the CETO conference in Manila in September of 1954, when we set up a treaty that said, in Article 4, that said an armed attack against any of the protocol states of the CETO treaty would be viewed as an attack against each of us, and we would act in accordance with our constitutional processes to respond to those attacks. It was very much like what we did in 45 when we agreed to the UN Charter. We agreed that if there is international aggression in a certain area, we would send our own military to try to stop it, and other countries would join us and send their military forces, and hopefully we'd never have to send any military forces, because just the fear that America was willing to do this and that other countries were too would lead most people to be deterred, would lead most tyrants to say there's no benefit in trying to conquer my neighbor, because as soon as they do it, the Americans and their allies are going to make my life very unhappy. They're going to respond and defeat me badly. And so, the great goal of the UN Charter was preemption. It was not that if attacks occurred, we would gang up on the aggressor. That was in there too, but more importantly, we would act to meet threats, or quote, threats to the peace around the world. If we concluded that a country was about to invade its neighbor, we would come together in New York and debate and discuss and demand that they defend what they're doing. And only a fool would say, I'm going to take on China, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, India, Indonesia, every other country in the world. That was a no-win situation. And maybe when they were filling out their battle plan, what are we going to do on day one and day two? They would come back and say, if I do this on day one, I'm going to get hurt badly. Maybe on day one I'll play tennis instead of commit aggression, and then we have a chance at peace. And I come away from all of this with a tremendous love for peace. I've seen war. I absolutely hate it. Because I believe it's so important, if we want to have peace, we must be prepared to pay whatever price is necessary to keep aggression from succeeding. It may mean that on 1, 2, 3 wars, we're going to pay a very bad price. hopefully at some point the world community will say, hey, you start a fight with your neighbor, you just started a fight with the rest of the entire world. Good luck to you. And aggression will just not happen. I think we're not in my lifetime to see an end of war and an end of aggression. But if we can persuade the people of the world of what this vision is, what this goal is we are trying to achieve, I think we've got a chance at achieving a real peaceful world where people, I tell my 20-year-old son that I study war and politics so that he can study business, so that his children and grandchildren can study art and music and all the fun things in life. But they're going to need security before they can do that. They're going to need freedom before they can do that. And they're going to need a sense of responsibility. If you don't want the tyrants to run your life for you and tell you what to do, you must be prepared to watch them carefully. Whoever volunteers to serve in government, the temptations to commit abuse, the temptations to become tyrants are tremendous. Lord Acton said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So as we entrust power to people, we need to be very attentive to how they use it and to take measures to make sure they will not, unnecessarily abuse the rights of the people. And it's not an easy task, but the consequences are so important and so great that it's worth the effort.
So I'm asking so many questions. The confusion, among American, and especially young American, and they don't understand about a war. So in short, can you describe, in your opinion, what is the Vietnam War? People call it the American War or they call Hanoi War. In your opinion, what is the Vietnam War in short?
Well, the Vietnam War was an armed struggle initiated by the international communist movement. It was not a monolithic movement in every sense. It was largely monolithic when we first went in. There were some differences, there were some rivalries going on, but the issue was, will the world community, of which the United States of America was the primary military player, just because we'd spent more money buying bombs and bullets than others had, would we, and the British and the French and others, would we act in the event of international armed aggression? If Hanoi played a considerable role in it, but Hanoi was also being guided by Moscow and by Beijing, and their goal was to show that they could use guerrilla warfare to take control of one country after another, and that once the Americans had been shown to be impotent, to be incapable of effectively responding to aggression, then people all over the world would see that if they wanted political power, all they had to do was to invite the communists in to accept weapons and training and so forth, and then following the communist advisors, they would seize control of one country after another. And then, as soon as we get control, we will throw the communists out. But in fact, by the time they got control, the communists had their own people who were in charge, and they threw them out. And so, to me, it was a world war in the sense that the outcome of the future of the world was at play. The issue was, will this new tactic, new in the sense of its use in this sense of asymmetrical, guerrilla warfare, what Mao called people's warfare, and Khrushchev and others called wars of national liberation, where the communists would send in a relatively small number of trainers with weapons and ammunition and money and all sorts of other stuff, and they would promote a political organization, and then they would start building up a military force, and then they would start low-level ambushes and bank robberies and kidnappings and other things to make money, to make them more powerful. This became a major test case of whether international communism could advance its cause militarily, one small country at a time. And if the Americans said, we can't play that game, we're not smart enough, we're not strong enough, we lack the will to stand up to this kind of aggression, well, then we were going to lose. And at some point, we were going to realize that we're losing this war and to have to make a decision. Okay, we're losing this war. Does it matter if one country after another falls to the communists and then they get together and act collectively against us? And I think the answer to that is yes, it does matter. Well, then, if we're going to lose it doing what we're doing now, how can we behave so as to change our chances of winning? And most of the answers that I see ultimately involve the possibility of using nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are so horrible. There's just no way we were going to use nuclear. We would have exploded a single nuclear weapon to save South Vietnam from conquest. So we had to find another way to do it. And I think we did. And I think in Vietnam, there was a learning curve. We made a lot of mistakes early on, but we got smarter as we went on. And the enemy made a lot of mistakes too. And I think that by 1972, things were going quite well in Vietnam militarily. By then, we were winning the war. Militarily, the Viet Cong in the South had largely ceased to exist. North Vietnamese regular forces, People's Army of Vietnam or PAVN forces, were fighting most of the war in the South. We were doing very well. The air war in North Vietnam had been very ineffective because we had been foolish in our belief that we could hit the enemy softly and that would deter them. And every time we hit them softly and then followed it up with a bombing pause so they could resupply their forces, we told them we were fools who lacked the will to defend our interest. But ultimately, by the end of 1972, after Linebacker II, we showed Hanoi that we did have the will to stand up to them. And we allowed them to shoot every SAM-2 surface-to-air missile they had in their inventory. And they shot down a lot of our airplanes when they did that. But when all the missiles were gone, we still had airplanes and we still had bombs and we could come back. And at that point, for the first time in the war, they realized they were involved in a war with a world-class superpower. And it shocked them. And they said, what do we sign? How do we stop this bombing? How do we stop this war? And we told them what. And the real sad thing is that by 1972, 1973, the war in Vietnam was won. Hanoi had lost its will, and we were prevailing. And sadly, in May of 1973, a new group of Congress people had been elected to power who were campaigning on anti-war causes. That was their big issue. And they were going to stop Vietnam. And they didn't understand that Vietnam was a war about northern aggression against South Vietnam and attacks on U.S. forces, even though now no serious person can argue with that because Hanoi has written too many books bragging about it. And so Hanoi ignored the experts, people like Bill Colby, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He knew Vietnam incredibly well. He had been there off and on for years. And when he went up to Congress to try to tell them what was going on, they wouldn't see him. He must be lying to us because I know we've lost the war and he seems to think that's not true. And I don't want to waste my time talking to a fool. And so Congress in May of 1973, passed an amendment that said after August 15th, 1973, no money in this or any other Appropriations Act may be spent to support combat operations in the air, on the ground, or off the shore of North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia. And, there is an American expression from boxing, professional boxing, we call it throwing in the towel. If your fighter is getting beat so badly, he can't win, rather than let him continue to be beaten to death, you pick up the towel and throw it out into the ring. And that tells the referee, we give up. And even if the fighter wants to keep fighting, fight's over. The manager controls the fight. And Congress threw in the towel. And the bill was actually signed into law on June 1st, 1973. And we've just, it's, what is it now, July 16th, 2013. So we're at, maybe the 40th or 50th anniversary of that, 40th anniversary, I guess. 40th anniversary, or 50th? 40. Oh, that's right, because the 50th would be the Tonkin resolution in August of 64. And then that would be August of next year would be the 50th. And at that point, Pham Van Dong, the premier of North Vietnam, who was reported to have said, the Americans won't come back now even if we offered them candy. The game was over, and Hanoi sent they kept the 325th Division back to protect Hanoi. And the rest of their army, they sent it to Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam behind columns of Soviet tanks to overthrow the governments of those countries, including the elected government of South Vietnam and Cambodia. It was a great tragedy, and of course the greater tragedy is what happened afterwards. What happened in U.S. ability to keep the peace in places like Angola and Afghanistan and Nicaragua, but also what happened to the people of Vietnam. Congress, by that statute, consigned to communist tyranny tens of millions of human beings who lost, South Vietnam was not perfect, but it was better than most countries in the third world. It had a remarkable amount of freedom. It had more freedom of speech and freedom of the press than Israel. But I remember when one of the allegedly Catholic journals, North Vietnam, talking about how wonderful the economy was, and everybody was so rich and so forth, and there was freedom, and it was just pure communist propaganda. But the National Assembly had passed a press law that required the government to allow the newspaper or the journal to continue publishing while it appealed its conviction. And it went through one level of courts and it got up to the Supreme Court when the case was upheld. But in that year plus period of time, they had continued to publish. Now, that's not true in most countries in time of war. This was a country fighting for its survival. And so, you've got millions or tens of millions of people losing their freedom and their chance for more freedom. You've got millions of people losing their lives. I don't think there are any really good, reliable figures for how many people were killed in Cambodia or Vietnam or Laos after the communists took over. We have some figures we can go on. An excellent study at Yale University called the Cambodian Genocide Program concluded that more than 20% of the people of Cambodia, 1.7 million human beings, were killed by Pol Pot and his regime. This was, it was the greatest genocide on a per capita per annum basis in the 20th century. Hitler killed more, Stalin killed more, Mao killed more, but not so quickly and not in such a small country. Mao killed in a country of billions, and it was just a great tragedy. And as you know, many Vietnamese fled the country on unseaworthy boats, just desperate to try anything for human freedom. And many of them were murdered and raped. They had all of their possessions stolen. Many of them, the boats just came apart and they drowned or were eaten by sharks. They were preyed upon by pirates. I don't know exactly what the figures are, but I saw one figure attributed to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who said that, he said roughly, it was either 1/3 or 1/2 of the people who fled Vietnam did not make it to safety in the boats. They died of starvation, thirst. They crashed. They were murdered and raped, whatever. And these, Stalin once said that this is a paraphrase, but the death of one child is a tragedy. The death of 1 million people is a statistic. Most people cannot conceive of the idea of 1.7 million Cambodians being killed, being murdered, being forced to starve. And Stalin is said to have said that the death of one child is a tragedy. The death of 1 million people is a statistics. That is, most Americans cannot comprehend the idea of 1.7 million Cambodians losing their lives as a result of government policy, including a policy that would take small children up by their ankles and smash them against trees until they stopped quivering, because killing them that way saved bullets. And very few Americans know what happened when the American government abandoned the people of Vietnam. I think telling that story is tremendously important. It's important for the people of Vietnam who sacrificed and lost their friends and families, but it's more important for the people of the United States who had the ability to continue protecting Vietnam. It had been an expensive venture, but we sat out World War II and we saw that one through to completion. Most of us are pretty damn proud we did that. The American people need to understand that when we were just frustrated with the war, we allowed our members of Congress to seize control of government and to cut off, not only to say we're not going to defend these, we're not going to give them all the aid they want, but to say we will not allow a single dollar of American money, even money we've already given the president, to be used to help these people against tyranny, against armed aggression. I'm 69 years old. It was the most shameful incident in my country's history in my lifetime of which I'm aware. There are other shameful incidents when we apprehended or rounded up and imprisoned 120,000 Americans in 1942 for the crime of having ancestors who once lived in Japan. That was a horrible abuse. But we are talking about millions of people losing their lives. And it's almost as if, if people don't know about it, maybe it never happened. There is a very moving book called The Diary of Anne Frank that most young Americans are familiar with. I remember when my little boy brought it home from school and told about how moved he was. The video, the documentary that you're producing, has the potential of being the Diary of Anne Frank of the Vietnam War. If you finish it, as it happens, you will have performed an incredible service to everyone who served and sacrificed. And I thank you for that.
Thank you very much, sir.